claim that an officer claims that there was no gun at the scene, that they were looking for it in the grass somewhere.
And these are actually police officer reports, not just frantic eyewitness recollections. These are officers on the scene trying to take control of a chaotic situation, and they're saying there is no gun. That's
right. These are official reports. So, and there's a lot of other things too. One of the questions that I had right away is, were the in a stand-down order, and that was based on the fact that
stand-down order on by whom, against whom?
Well, on the Congresswoman on the Corner event. Usually, when there's some type of event like that, where you have a Congresswoman or any type of political rally going on like that, that there usually is some sort of
security.
Yeah, there's some sort of.
And Judge John Roll, his Marshal Service protection had been pulled the week before.
That's right.
Imagine that. And he himself may have been a target, the real target of this attack. We'll get back to that on the other side. You're listening to Stephanie Sledge on The Alex Jones Show. Welcome back to The Alex Jones Show. We are talking to Stephanie Sledge about the Tucson shooting, the anomalous evidence that has arisen out of the Tucson shooting of last year. Before we went to break, and if you're calling in, ask Stephanie a question, be patient. After this segment, we will be taking callers asking Stephanie about her findings, which are fascinating, which is why we brought him here to the Alex Jones Show. And Stephanie, right before we broke, we were talking about the stand-downs on security for the supposed targets of the shooting in Arizona. And this is another common thread of the false flag methodology. Is you see a stand down of the security that would normally be there. And they usually stand it down right before the event. And here we have a week before the event in Tucson, the mass shooting that injured Gabrielle Giffords and killed Judge John Roll. And he had his Marshal Service pulled. And there was no security for this high VIP event. I mean, this is not before the age of terror. This was in 2011. Everyone obviously knows that there are dangers out there, especially these days when there are political events, and there is no security. Is that correct, Stephanie?
Right, that is correct. And Judge John Roll, a couple of reports have come out. I haven't been able to quite pin down which one is the truth, but one of them stated that Judge John Roll had asked for his Marshal Service protection to be removed, and another had reported that it was removed. It was just removed. So,
well, I guarantee that he did not ask, because we have two competing news releases. One of them is damage control, and obviously the good judge, cannot answer or confirm that question anymore. And so his security was pulled, and Judge John Roll had been a pivotal figure in gun rights. He was recognized by Sheriff Mack for his favorable rulings on the Brady bill. And there's not a whole lot of federal judges who can receive praise from Sheriff Mack, and one of them happens to get shot, and it's turned into a gun control event.
Well, and I found it suspicious because he was working. He had several cases that were considered to be a threat to his life that he was working on. And so I found it very interesting that his protection was pulled, as well as the fact that standard procedure for these events usually have at least one ambulance nearby, some type of police helicopter mounted somewhere, in close range, also the crowd control, and usually 4 to 5 police officers with some type of surveillance. So there was none of that provided at the scene, and I found that very,
this is not some whistle-stop tour, in the 1930s Depression era where a gubernatorial candidate is shaking hands with local farmers. This was a announced event in during the War on Terror. Every agency, and this was a large town, Tucson, has contingency plans, and it appears that it was just a 911 response, that there was nothing in place. Right,
that's absolutely correct. And other things, too, that came about that made me, really look into this a little bit further is, there was a lot of photos that were released of the crime scene, but when I went out there, a lot of the photos didn't match the crime scene. And
you've been on the scene. You're not just an internet sleuth. You went out there, and I know Andrew Griffin, whom we had early on, he went out there.
He was out there last year.
And so you're saying you went there and actually walked the ground. And
I did.
And the photos do not match up.
Some of them do, and some of them don't. There are some that have been released. the backgrounds do not match like the actual crime scene. And so, that led me to look into it a little bit further. And also, too, there's a lot of other things that didn't add up, like how many bullets were actually, fired that are inconsistent with the autopsy reports, victims, witnesses at the scene that say
we mentioned RFK earlier. RFK had come up. Sirhan related to this. Obviously, you have the mind control. I mean, and with Sirhan, his own psychologist said that he was a hypnotized patsy. Every psychiatrist who treated him was amazed at how easy it was to hypnotize this man. It was very indicative of large-scale, prior, deep hypnosis. And Sirhan later claimed, of course, and to this day, that he has no memory of what actually happened in that pantry. And then now we have another correlation, the number of bullets. The number of bullet shell casings found at the scene in the pantry in L.A. where RFK was killed exceeded the capacity of Sirhan's gun. And now we're looking at Tucson, and once again, we have too many bullets. Well, and the accuracy rate that Jared Lee Loughner allegedly had was 100%. I mean, he allegedly shot. They initially the super soldier. Yes,
like Nick Bryan in Australia.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. We see this time and time again. These outlandish notions passed off as reality, managed by the mainstream media, splicing tapes together, giving us fake photos. What's that for, folks? What are they hiding? You're listening to the Alex Jones Show. We'll be right back after this. Down at high noon on the Alex Jones Show. I'm guest hosting Holland Van Den Oornoff, joined by
Chris Emery with Free Mind Films out of Oklahoma City. We're glad to be here.
And our guest is Stephanie Sledge, and we're getting callers on the line, and we will get to you in just a minute or two. I know this information, this is fascinating, and you want to ask Stephanie yourself, so in just in a couple seconds, we'll start bringing the callers on board to ask Stephanie your questions. And just before we went to break, we were talking about the fact that the number of shell casings, the evidence is not matching up with the official story of the Tucson shooting. Before we go to callers, Stephanie, and we just touched the tip of the iceberg of the evidence that you have on the governmentrag.com. But let's talk about the correlations to the recent shooting in Colorado. What do you see similar happening in Colorado that you have unearthed yourself in Tucson? Hello, Stephanie.
Okay. It's like we may have...
Well, we got it. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
The first... Sorry. I don't know what happened. There was a cutout. The first similarity that I found was the fact that there was a gag order put in place, which is very common with these false flags. The first thing is the gag order. And so nobody's allowed to talk, and so that... conditions the populace that, But yet the media is allowed to make all the conjecture and lies they want. It's just the principals involved who may be speaking on true evidence. They're not allowed to talk. Is that correct? That's right. And there are other things that are very similar that I found as far as agenda is concerned. First of all, everything always starts out with something negative with the shooter, like dressed in black, or something that coincides with an agenda. And, of course, we know after the Tucson shooting that a lot of the agenda that's being pushed through is not only just about gun control, but it's also about taking away our freedom of rights and our freedom of expression. And so, terrorists have been listed as wearing all black hoodies, a number of things. So there's a lot of that has a lot of similarities. Yeah, and also I noticed the commonality of the extended clip, or what they incorrectly call it. It's a magazine, right, people. It's a magazine. The extended magazine debate, which goes back to the Brady Bill, which was a limitation on magazine capacity of rifles and pistols that was in place for 10 years in this country, expired just a couple years ago. And they were really sorry that provision expired. But that's the only way they could get it passed because of the strength, the support for the Second Amendment in this country. And now we see in both shootings the use of an extended magazine, which of course is the Brady argument. And then we have one of the targets killed in Tucson was a judge who had ruled favorably for gun rights back in the 90s on the Brady Bill. So I think what we're seeing is this implanting of and they're already talking about how military arms should not be in the hands of American citizens on the streets. These are not military arms. And when extended magazines are no advantage.
they are largely a gimmick. And in fact, in the Colorado shooting, the extended magazine failed, which is why he had to go to a secondary weapon. But it's not about the real lethality of an extended magazine. It's about demonizing large capacity weapons, which means going back to the Brady provisions. And if extended magazines were any more effective, any more lethal than a regular magazine, you would see the military using them. But they do not, because they confer no advantage. The people who are using them on a daily basis to defend themselves and to shoot people do not use extended magazines because it offers no advantage. So the argument is without worth and points towards the true agenda, which is using Brady-like provisions to limit gun rights. But before we go to callers, there's one more point I really need to break up. Another agenda at play here was research into, am I correct, suspended animation.
Right. That was the medical agenda behind the scenes of the Tucson shooting. And suspended animation was quite interesting to study because I personally had never heard of it before I had started this case. And so I looked into exactly when the news broke that they had performed a procedure called suspended animation. I immediately thought in my head that this goes deep, so I'm going to look into it. And what I found
and this was on Gabby Giffords, who survived her gun wound to the head because somehow they were able to keep her afloat through suspended animation, slowing down her bodily functions. Is that correct?
That's right. It's a cooling process is what it is. There's a long description for it, but the short description is basically where your soul is suspended. You're neither dead nor alive. You're just suspended. So, and I found a lot of interesting agenda coming out through the University of Arizona, and a lot of the doctors that perform the surgery have a lot of very deep ties into the military as well as.
Oh, well, let's not forget also that Gabby Giffords, as we were all reminded time and time again, was married to an astronaut who worked for NASA, and of course, any agency more than any other who would be interested in a suspended animation research would be NASA. Of course, for interstellar travel or for deep space travel as portrayed in science fiction movies. Maybe if we actually want to send a man to Mars, we will use suspended animation, at least to Jupiter.
Well, and an interesting point about NASA and suspended animation is following the shooting, NASA did capture, I don't have those notes in front of me, but I believe they captured dark matter using suspended animation. And what they're using it for is, just like the movie Angels and Demons, it's like a crystal ball. And so they're able to see the future with it. And, of course, it also, the Brain Trauma Foundation, which, is George Soros, and it leads to the Open Society Institute and all that, ties back to these Peace Corps and, Dr. Peter Reed, who performed the procedure, is heavily
Well, all you got to do,
that.
and you have done it, Stephanie, I highly advise those of you listening and watching to check out the governmentrag.com to chase down these leads that she has presented. The links are tremendous. And just like the Colorado shooting, here we have the introduction of the notion of suspended animation. There's not a whole lot of people involved in suspended animation work who are married to NASA astronauts, but they just happen to get shot in the head in Tucson, Arizona.
Yeah, the probability is extra.
And they use suspended animation. Anyways,
Right.
we're going to start taking. Hold on, Steph. We're going to start taking callers in a second. For those of you listening, the call-in number is 1-800-259-9231. I repeat, 800-259-9231. And go ahead, Stephanie, wrap up, and then we're going to hit the callers.
As far as what DARPA wanted, you have to understand that following the shooting, the FDA did approve suspended animation, and the Army funded research projects into suspended animation, including DARPA has an interest in it too, and they are performing procedures that involve.
So that agenda was fulfilled. Getting these deep pockets to fund the suspended animation research. So
that's right.
That is